I am so excited to get to talk to you. It's kind of cool when you're a woman in science and you get to have a sit-down chat, even as brief as it is sometimes, with another woman in science. You always seem to find a commonality, right? And it's a sisterhood, if you will, that seems to be expanding. And it expands because more and more girls are being, they're being exposed to more and more possibilities. And your name comes up a lot in talking to girls and women who have been inspired. How does that make you feel to know that you're the inspiration for future generations?
Well, I think it's one of the greatest and best privileges that come with earning the astronaut label is that it opens hearts and minds in many, many ways to take a look at you, to maybe think about emulating you, wondering if they can follow you. I was inspired by lots of people growing up, mainly men, frankly, but I didn't see them, and our family was not wired to say, well, yes, those are men doing that, dear. It was, look, there are people that do these interesting things, and you're a people. And the attributes I was really drawn to in the early astronauts, Jacques Cousteau, people like that, people I read about in books, they were leading these lives that were like seemingly constantly inquisitive and adventurous. You get a little older, you realize the adventure and inquisitiveness isn't always constant. It's got its rough patches and its dull patches, but that's what really drew me. And the notion that only men can be inquisitive, only men can be adventurous was just a non-starter in our family and with my parents. So I was encouraged to just pursue all the interests that came to me and supported to explore them. You get to decide if they're a hobby, a passing fad, the thread of a life's work. That's up to you. And I think the seed that grew in me was nobody gets to edit your interests. Now, the world is full of people. Many of them may well have an opinion about your interests and whether you should have those interests or not. Yeah, but an opinion is just a puff of air, unless you give it some power. So they don't get to edit what you're interested in.
I love it. That's a great way to put it, most certainly. You know, you've been to space 3 times.
3 times?
You've been to the bottom of the Mariana Trench.
Only did that once.
Yeah, that's plenty, right? You're the only human being to do that.
Not quite. There are now 2 others. Victor Vescovo, who invited me along on that dive to the Challenger Deep in his submersible. He later took a ride. I think it was with, I forget if it was Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic. Blue, I think. And Hamish Harding, who also had done Mariana's Trench with Victor, came along. So I think we're 3 now.
But you were first.
I was the first person. And I am still the most vertical person in the world.
What do you mean vertical? Tell us about that.
Orbital height to the deepest point on Earth. So unless you cheat and go all the way to the moon, you can't beat that.
When it comes to training and having to tackle the highest high and the deepest deep, is the training similar across those platforms, or is there a difference in the training?
If you're going to be an active pilot or an operating engineer with a really substantive role, there will be some fair degrees of similarity. In my case, I was exactly that on a space shuttle with a combination of both scientific and engineering responsibility. So you really need to know whatever cargo and experimental elements you're working with, because each of the 3 mission specialists would have one there, the lead on, and then they would be backing up a colleague on 1 or 2 more. So you really have to master those. And of course, as I joke, when you get up in a space station or in the space shuttle, mom isn't there and the Maytag repairman isn't there. So if something gets messy or dirty, guess who's cleaning it up? If something breaks, guess who's going to have to know how to fix it? So there's a lot of wonderfully fun technical stuff to master about the vehicle itself, and then all the work that you're doing aboard the vehicle. On the dive, it's a really single-person submersible. There are only 2 people in it. And Victor was fully certified. He dived it solo to the Marianas Trench and other places probably a dozen times before I went along with him. So really, to be honest, all I had to do on that was I brought some scientific gear and some expertise along to help with one of the key elements that Victor was working on scientifically. But beyond that, frankly, in terms of training, it boiled down to learn how to climb in, learn how to climb out. Be sure that you can talk to the surface through the underwater comms if something happens to Victor. Be sure you know where the release is that will emergency drop all the weights so that you rise back to the surface in case Victor can't do that. And otherwise, sit still for a long time, be good company,
Yeah.
and have a nice ride.
Patience is everything, right?
Patience is everything. Yeah. So it was, the principal thing we were trying to do on the series of dives that I went out on was to sharpen the measurement of the depth at the very bottom of the Challenger Deep. It's very, very hard to measure the depth of the ocean, period, and the deeper and deeper you go, the harder and harder it gets. So you do it by measuring the pressure at that great depth. And I think when we started out in that campaign, I could give you a number for how deep the Challenger Deep is, but it was like plus or minus 150 feet. So it's, somewhere in here. And Victor was hoping to get that down to plus or minus 30-ish feet or maybe 50 feet, cut it down by a lot. So we loaded up with extra pressure sensors, and I brought some NOAA expertise to bear, because guess what? That's a math problem in the end. You take all the different sensors you've put down on the bottom, they've all stabilized at that depth, then you have to account for all sorts of other properties, up to and including the wind speed and pressure of the atmosphere at the surface. It's a very complex equation that my NOAA guys could do to back that out, and we succeeded at doing that. But that's a pretty passive thing. You're just letting the sensors equilibrate to the depth you're at. There's not really much you have to operate from with the submersible to do that.
So when most people know you for your shuttle missions and for being an astronaut in that incredible class that you were in, and those women. And what were those relationships like? You have Sally Ride there and Judy Resnick. And just Judy Resnick from Akron. What were those relationships like? Because that was pretty groundbreaking.
Yeah, it was an interesting mix of both a strong degree and a very special kind of bond. And I think the early days when we were the brand new kids, we were going through the press gauntlet, all that sort of thing. We bonded on a number of points there. I think all had a similar recognition that however we did in our roles, each of the six of us was going to have a big effect on who was able to come after us and what kind of reception they got and what sort of opportunities they got. Women who'd pioneered in aviation and been in the space program in ground roles before us, they'd gotten the door, they'd helped get the door open for us. The door was ajar. It was no longer nailed shut. And I think we were all pretty intent to make sure that we comported ourselves and performed in a way that made sure the door was even wider open for women who came behind us. So that was a common bond. We had very, very different interests. One or two of us didn't like running at all. Others liked sports and running a lot. Some were more, home and fashion and musical inclined. Others, like me, have borderline no musical talent except to appreciate it. So it's not like we socialized a whole lot together after that first year when we were sort of going through grad school for astronauts together. And then, of course, you're in the background aware that you're somehow all 35 of you are in some kind of unknown competition for who gets to fly when. And everyone wants to fly soon and wants to fly a lot and is envious of any flight that goes up that they're not on. So all of that is swirling around a bit. So there's a competitive colleagues dimension to it as well.
So when they came to you and said, so we're thinking spacewalk, what was your reaction?
Well, I was really excited about that. I had done some work in NASA's High Altitude Research Aircraft program, like my second or so year in the program. So I had already been certified in pressure suits and flown at 67,000 feet on long missions. Was comfortable in the suit, not prone to claustrophobia. It felt like a really familiar environment. And obviously spacewalking is one of the really super cool things to do. So I wangled my way. I had not been assigned to work on spacesuits or spacewalks officially, but I spotted one of the guys that was, a guy named Bruce McCandless, and talked to him at the gym one day and said, I'd really like to have some experience in the suit. Told him about my suit qualification, so forth and so on. So he was doing early development runs underwater to get some experiments and things ready for the shuttle. Test them out early, help improve the design, that kind of thing. And he took me along on one of those over at NASA Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And that was my first exposure to working underwater in a spacesuit. And this would have been 1979 or 80 maybe. So the actual shuttle spacewalking suit wasn't ready yet. And so I got slammed into Pete Conrad's old Apollo lunar suit, which sort of kind of almost fit, but not entirely.
So when you finally get into the suit and they open the hatch, tell me about that moment.
Well, on one level, it's a very familiar moment because you've gone through that in rehearsal in the underwater simulations countless times. And there's also a very high fidelity mock-up of the space shuttle that includes a perfectly realistic and functioning airlock. So you've gone through the whole getting dressed and checking out the suit in that airlock as well multiple times. So it's a very familiar set of steps to do. Now you're aware though that this is the real one. And you would think that when you get just a few minutes from opening the hatch, it's clear sailing and here you go. And actually, as with a launch, the closer you get to that moment, the harder it is to actually reach the moment. More and more things are being checked more and more carefully before you push that switch and launch the shuttle or turn the crank and open the airlock hatch. And of course, in your simulations and practices, there are instructors trying to put you through your paces that just make sure lots of things go wrong at all those key moments to see if they can distract you or discombobulate you, or can you figure out fast enough how to get it done. So at least for me, and on that first flight, there's that background circuit kind of always running of, okay, someone is going to make something go wrong here. I'm not going to get really comfortable with this is just going to be clear sailing, spring loaded for what's going to bite us, what do we have to do about it. That didn't happen, of course, and it was just, please don't anybody come up with a reason that we can't go outside. Let's go.
That feeling of like, this is it now.
Yeah.
This is that moment I've been waiting for so long.
Well, my father was in mission control at that moment, and behind the glass in the sort of viewing room. And that room, the console that you look into closest by you is the flight surgeon console, who of course is monitoring the heart rate sensors that are on Dave Liesma and me. And the surgeon saw my dad and recognized him, and there's a little shield that prevents the general audience from seeing anybody's heart rate, but he just gestured to my dad and moved the shield aside so he could, this is Kathy's heart rate. And this became the family joke for years after that my father was just nonplussed. They open the hatch and my little girl's heart rate spikes to 78 and then goes down to 52, or just some ridiculous number. And then it was, you know where you are, you know what you're doing.
Right.
On the shuttle, when you came out of the airlock, you were usually face down towards the keel, towards the bottom of the shuttle. So you didn't go out into a void. You came out into what seemed like a large room, and you could then look around and see the Earth and space. But you came out into a physical environment. The airlock on the space station sort of sticks up from the station rather more like a coffee can. And so station astronauts, many of them have talked about pulling themselves out of that hatch, and suddenly their line of sight goes 200 miles down towards the Earth. And sometimes, for some of them, it induces a feeling that you're not falling, but your eye and your brain tell you, that's a long way down, surely you must be falling.
Wow, how surreal that must be.
Yeah.
Just incredible. You have had, quite a few different paths in your career, and you land in Ohio at COSI. How did that whole thing come about?
I was serving as the chief scientist at NOAA at that time, so in the early mid-90s, 92 to 95-ish. And I was starting to think about what did I want to do after my presidential term ended. Did I want to go back to NASA? Did I want to go to academia, into the corporate sector, quite what? And COSI, of course, had a headhunter looking around, and she called me purportedly to ask if I would be interested in corporate board seats if I was planning to leave NOAA at the end of the term, and would I be interested in doing some board work. And I had thought about that, so I said, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. We met for dinner, and then she pivoted around and said, well, actually, there's this museum in Ohio. And I knew dimly about COSI. I'd only been to Ohio once. It was on our baby astronaut trip, on our familiarization tours of all the different NASA centers. And and I have no family here, I have no connections here. But I really had liked the kind of work I had done on a volunteer basis with science museums as an astronaut in the years leading up to that. And so that had my curiosity quivering a little bit. So I agreed to fly on out and at least have, I mean, I'm an odd pick. I've not run a science museum. I have no museum administrative experience. It's going to be an unusual pick if they go with me. But I figured, well, always good to do the interview anyway and see what you learn. So out I came.
Wow. And I mean, it's been great for them, great for the state of Ohio, home of astronauts. And
Great for me.
Now you're back. You get to be one of us, most certainly.
That's right.
Have you found any kids yet that walk up and just say, I love maps? Do you identify with that child immediately?
Absolutely right away, yeah, yeah. But my interests have always been so diverse and so wide. It's pretty easy for me to spot something in a young kid's story that I've got at least some empathy for, maybe dabbled with a little bit myself. And it's hugely confirming. It's a huge boost of confidence for a youngster, I think maybe even for any of us, some bit of affirmation from a person, from an older person or a person you've admired a bit, that it just sort of endorses that you've got some good stuff in you. Hey, that sounds like an interesting track. Hey, yeah, go get them.
Sometimes we all just need that, just somebody to identify in us what we can't see ourselves.
Right, or you maybe think you have it, but someone confirms, yeah, that's really cool.
Were you discouraged at any point as you're going through your educational process, which, we're all life learners, but I can point back to, I was never discouraged, but I also was never really encouraged. I kind of found my own way to meteorology. Did you run into that?
I think it was sizably finding my own way through most of the pathway. Some, just generally really good teachers, even in elementary school, that just endorsed, good work, and you get that bit of satisfaction, that bit of confidence that I actually know how to do this stuff well. Okay, and you keep building on that. It's like climbing up a staircase. The one pivotal one was my freshman year of college, and I actually started college as a language and linguistics major. That was a talent I knew I had, just a natural flair. I figured I could somehow turn that into a career where people buy me airplane tickets to go explore the world and live in exotic places. And so I had taken these science courses because it's obligatory for freshmen. And one of them was an oceanography course taught by a very young professor. He might have been 2 years out of grad school, and he absolutely was surfer dude, hair, a blonde guy, beach tan, fit the bill completely. And I was just enthralled with the marine biology class I had taken before and his general oceanography class. I mean, just sucking the content out of textbooks, loving all the field trips we did on the weekends, eating it up. And I finally worked up the courage to, I didn't know what that meant. I know I'm really good at this. This is really fascinating me. What should I do? What should I do with this? I walked up to him at the end of class one day, and we joke about this to this day. I had a question to ask. I could not and did not formulate any intelligent version of it. It boiled down to, this is really fascinating me. I don't know what to do with it. I'm really good at languages. What do you guys do? What is, I mean, you lecture freshmen, okay. What do you guys do? What does be an oceanographer mean? And it pays to pick the right person when you do that. Because I suspect an awful lot of professors, they would have just sneered at my hugely stupid way of forming the question, demeaned me for not being able to ask an intelligent question, slapped, get the French major out of here, I'm teaching real science. This guy did exactly the opposite. He just encouraged me. I spent part of the weekend in his lab with him, and he fielded all the other dumb questions I had. What else interested you? And he'd pull out a map or pull out a sample and just probe a little bit into anything that had sparked my interest. And I didn't put any of those questions very intelligently either. But and I think this is an important thing with young people, but a little bit with anybody, but the younger the more it's important. There's a curiosity. There's something under that stupidly put question, or that naively put question, and you have a moment, just a moment to decide whether you're going to laugh at or ridicule the idiocy, the naivete, the overly simplistic, or are you going to pick at what's underneath there and grow it a little bit? And he did that for me.
That's such a great way to present it for education purposes and beyond too, because you just never know what's going to come next from the answer.
Right. And sometimes, if things are just still very frothy in your mind, if you've got a safe zone where you can blurt out the question that sort of captures what's niggling at you, but you can't quite formulate it brilliantly, I think that's part of the creative process. If someone's just going to slap that down because you didn't get exactly the right brilliant words, you go cut the person's arm off, or I may as well.
I could sit here and pepper you with questions for hours. Believe me, I'm fascinated. But I do have to ask you to tell the goldfish crackers in space story.
If you've been taught good manners, I'm sure you've been taught to not play with your food at dinner. But it turns out that rule is suspended in space. It is fair to play with your food. And water is very fun to play with. You can make balls of water and puff them around with your breath. But the other favorite thing that I like to do was we had Pepperidge Farm goldfish crackers in little snack packs. And if you cut the top off of that pack and pull the pack away, the goldfish stay right where they were. You pulled the bag, not the fish. And so you now have this little cloud of goldfish. So when I'm talking to young school kids, I have them do the mind experiments with me. Imagine opening your goldfish bag and pull it back, and I ask them, what are the goldfish doing? Oh, they're flying around. No, you didn't pull on them. Oh, just mesmerized. So only in zero gravity will Pepperidge Farm goldfish display schooling behavior.
It's hilarious. I love that. Thank you so much. I really am excited to get to chat with you a little
Likewise.
bit. And it's quite an honor, so I appreciate it.
Very welcome.